Good afternoon, dear participants. Welcome back. I hope you had a good break. Coming up now is a panel discussion. This panel discussion is on developing procurement resilience, and this discussion will be moderated by Dr. Nikhil Gurjar, President, Consulting Connoisseurs. Please put your questions in the chat box. Again, at the end of the discussion, we'll take up the questions. Dr. Gurjar is the president of Consulting Connoisseurs, a management consulting firm based out of Bombay. He is a professional with strengths in the areas of modeling and simulation based management consulting, project and supply chain management, and technology based transformation. Dr. Gurjar is a pioneer in the field of simulation based management consulting in India and has also worked in several sectors, including steel, specialty materials, oil, white goods, consumer goods, education, IT, robotics, technology, garment, and textiles. Over to you, Dr. Gurjar.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Am I audible? Just doing a
Yes,
quick
yes.
check. Yes. Okay. Thanks a lot for the introduction. And yeah, so today we are having a very interesting set of discussions that we have seen in the morning also, and now we are going to see some more. And this particular panel is specifically about the procurement resilience, as we say. And in this panel, we've got some real interesting people. So let me go ahead and introduce them rather quickly and start with the discussion. So, first, I would like to introduce Dr. Gian Luigi Albano, who is the head of division at Concept, which is the national central purchasing body in Italy. And he's also an adjunct professor of economics at University of Luigi Gicali in Rome. Uh, we have our second panelist who is Ram Raghuraman. Ram is the founder and the CEO at BCube Global Solutions, which is a boutique consulting firm offering curated solutions in operations, supply chain, and strategy. And he also was actively involved with ISM India previously as one of the regional directors. Our third panelist is Les Ball. He basically is a global supply chain and procurement leader. Well, he's got a very checkered career. He's spanned across different geographies. He was formerly the CPO of ABB, and he was also associated with Ford and Eaton. So, with these few words, I know there's a lot to speak about the speakers themselves, but I think we could start our discussion. So, welcome all of you, and so let us start our interaction on procurement resilience. Uh, I would first touch upon one of the strategic parameters, supply chain and procurement resilience. It's considered good news for procurement, but bad news for the microeconomists because it tends to increase the costs beyond their lean values. So thereby it increases the cost of the product. So in other words, we see that we are going away from the desired optimum in terms of costs. So how do we perceive this particular argument, and what is the strategic perspective and the economic perspective? So I would first like to invite Gian to share a few thoughts on this.
Well, thank you. I hope you can hear me well. Greetings
Yes.
from Rome, although I have a picture in the background which reminds of the mountains in the north. Refreshing picture, hopefully. It's an honor again to be part of this, the biggest uh, uh, conference in supply chain and procurement. And I'm really pleased that you have raised a point which is really an economic point about resilience. And let me sort of It won't take very long, but I'd like to make a couple of logical steps to get into the heart of the problem. So let me start with this. Suppose for a moment that we have an idea what is the implementation of a resilience strategy, what should be done in order to strengthen the supply chain. Suppose that, and it's a very strong assumption, and I'll tell you why in a moment. Now, obviously, if all sellers and then ultimately, since I'm in public procurement, ultimately public buyers were to agree that this is an important thing to do, that the risk of global disruptions is so high that we need to take an action, then if there were to be a coordination, then in principle, it is as if collectively we were buying an insurance to make sure that we do not, we don't get global trade supply chain frozen for 2 years, so to speak. Now, when you buy an insurance, normally as a private consumer, as a private individual, we tend to take for granted we have to pay for that. And we pay for that just because we want to make sure that if an adverse element, event strikes, we will be protected. So to some extent, when you rephrase this as an insurance, everyone would agree that indeed it would be beneficial to buy an insurance. Now, if you look at the microeconomics, and thank you for using that particular word in the title of this first opening discussion, turns out that when you get to the level of a single individual firm decision-making process, that becomes a little bit more complicated. Because suppose that you as a firm, you like to have your ecosystem of suppliers, stronger. So you're willing to pay for that. But at the same time, you're competing with other 100 different firms that might want to take advantage of the fact that you're investing on this insurance. And in a very short term, they might use this as a competitive leverage to steal market shares. So it's in a way, and I don't want to make this more simplistic than it is. It's again, once more, a kind of prisoner's dilemma kind of story. So although we compete in the market, we would like to have some degrees of cooperation among competing firms, because it would be in the collective interest to have a stronger ecosystem of suppliers. And the longer the supply chain, the more more fragmented, the more we should coordinate in order to have this ecosystem. But every single firm will have an incentive not to do so, because by not doing so, it would gain a competitive advantage, at least in the short term. And all other guys, knowing this, would immediately mimic that solution. So all of a sudden, the castle, this idea of a social protection, would crumble just because there is a very strong incentive, at least in the short term, not to do so. So in a way, whenever there is a failure to act in a coordinated way, there is normally, this is what we teach students in every single university in the world, there is room for public intervention. But now, could we think of a public intervention so as to kind of push private companies to buy that insurance? I mean, I think this is extremely difficult, because the only way you can do that is by using regulation. But you cannot use regulation to push firms, to basically oblige them to buy an insurance they don't want to buy, because it's part of the market to decide the way they want to compete. But if they compete in a standard fashion, looking at the very short term, no one is going to willing to invest in an extra insurance to get, a stronger supply chain. And the longer the supply chain, those incentives replicate at every single stage of the supply chain. Every single supplier who is a supplier to another firm has exactly the same problem that, a downstream firm will have. So ultimately, let me summarize by saying that one of the drawbacks of a global system is that when it comes to actions that are really coordinate actions, they are by far much difficult to take, because you would have to take, millions of firms to coordinate simultaneously to do so. And so I think that if you look at the private perspective, this is extremely challenging. And maybe there are sectors which you could achieve because the ecosystem is a geographically, localized, you name it. But if the competition is global, this is extremely difficult. So I don't want to leave the audience with a too pessimistic message. But in fact, when I have a chance to mention what's happening in the public sector, things are even worse, to be honest. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll stop here.
Thanks a lot. I think that went a little longer than what we expected. Yeah, Les, would you like to add something to it?
Yeah, I agree, and thanks for the comments, Gian, and thank you for having me, Dr. Gurjar, as well on the panel. From an industrial manufacturing point of view, I have a slightly different view. All of my previous companies actually gained business post-COVID because they had a very robust, a big, ugly initiative, which was called resilience and sustainability. And they used it and rallied behind it, and in fact had lost business that they regained in each case, each of my last three companies, because they put the customer first. They had a very strong set of processes in place. They had people across the function that understood this wasn't just a procurement thing. And as we know, with COVID, costs went out of the window. People said, just get the product. We don't care if you've got to air freight or whatever you've got to do. And, I think I won't name the three companies, but 2 out of the 3 gained business and didn't really have any disruption from COVID, despite being heavily sourced in countries that were under lockdown. So I think there's 2 sides of the coin. It is very complex. I don't think there is one solution fits all. But it certainly is a source of competitive advantage for industrial organizations.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Les. Let's move on to the next, aspect that we are trying to look at. See, one of the points which is critical is the way one predicts and forecasts, because that's what drives, the kind of necessity for storing inventories and making the resilience component understood. So prediction and forecasting is basically a critical cornerstone in defining and developing resilience. So, and here I would probably invite Ram first. So, how far could one predict and how accurately could one forecast? I mean, how are companies working over these challenges? And more importantly, are you seeing that there is some kind of a limit to where we could go given our current technologies? Yeah, over to you, Ram.
Thanks, Nikhil. And am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Well, I'd like to start off by thanking ISM and World Bank for this opportunity. It's an honor to be a part of this panel with my fellow esteemed speakers. Hello. I think as we speak about prediction and forecasting, and again, all these things they've assumed greater significance in the post-COVID world. The last part of your question was, I think, is something that is easier to tackle. I think in terms of technology is highly advanced. I think it's just now that, and the possibilities are rather limitless. I wouldn't say limitless. There is a limit, obviously, but again, the possibilities are endless. It's just now that organizations are playing catch up in terms of how they utilize the technology. And I think, for example, what I mean by that is, there's artificial intelligence, machine learning, which is constantly evolving and learning as we go along. Organizations use, sensors and Internet of Things to capture real-time data. There are highly advanced simulations that are available that can, pretty much forecast, accurately model different scenarios and give you various outputs. So if anything, I believe, from a technology perspective, there is a huge possibility in terms of how we leverage it. It's just the lack of, I wouldn't even call it lack, but we're just getting to grips with, understanding how we can utilize technology to our benefit. And The other important one, which is a critical aspect, is more than the resource standpoint. Limitations in data are what are constraining how we utilize technology, both in terms of availability of data and in terms of the quality of data available. I think that's important. So uh, I think that's a perfect segue into, for example, what we're talking about. How far can we predict and how accurate can we go? I mean, it entirely depends on a variety of factors. I've already spoken about uh, data availability and quality. That's one of the significant uh, 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 parameters that influence how far you can go and how deep you can go. The other one that makes it harder, I think, is the complexity of the supply chain in itself. I think if you look at modern supply chains, they are fairly geographically spread out. There are multiple nodes. They're involving a variety of products or commodities, and there's multimodal logistics in play, and trying to map all these. And when we're talking about there's multiple nodes, these, you can imagine, these are for the multiple data formats that you'll have to somehow map into a common system and try to make sense of it. And especially, I mean, if you look at a particular supplier may have a particular a data format, and then you'll get the data in a different format from a different supplier. So trying to gather all this, I think gathering is perhaps easier, but trying to consolidate, put it all and map it out is a really gargantuan exercises. I mean, there is technology that aids, but again, trying to put this into an algorithm that does all this for you is complicated. So I think that's the major constraint. And even as you go about predicting and forecasting, I think if you look at it, behaviorally very stable and predictable environments are easier to forecast. It's always, you know what's happening. It's a tried and tested method, and those often work. But it's really turned upside down in the recent past. There's a lot of disruptions. There's a lot of there's a lot of changes. There's a lot of dynamism in the world that we live in. So, having said that, I think it's I think in terms of forecasting, and I'm talking about accuracy here, you don't want to use data and make wrong predictions. So I think in order to limit, because you might spend a lot of time and resources and energy on something, on an event that you predicted as an outcome, but it's never going to happen, right? So there is a trade-off that you'll have to consider and try to limit your horizon window. I think that the shorter your horizon windows, the more I think useful your
The
predictions.
shorter it is, the more difficult it is for using machine learning because you have lesser data points. And the other thing, like you mentioned, coming from a public procurement background myself, the fundamental element is that of distrust. And when the
Correct.
distrust element is there, then you cannot do much. I don't know, Gian, we also use a lot of game theory. I don't know what your experience on that says.
Well, I want to add something, more related to the fact that, there is a tendency to, which is natural because it's hardwired in our, the way our brain works, that, we extrapolate from the past in order to predict something about the future. There's nothing we can do. I mean, this is where, the way we survived in the jungle in Africa. So it's very simple. So the point is, we tend to think that something potentially disruptive will be similar to COVID. All right, because we have experienced COVID, and so we tend to think, oh, it's going to be like that. But another pandemic is likely to be completely different. So the point is, to what extent we can say that the COVID lesson, suppose we have learned a lot of lessons, and I think we have learned a lot, might be useful for a completely different kind of a pandemic. So many people say, we don't know. The point is not whether it's going to be another pandemic, but it's only when. But the point is, what kind of pandemic? So the point is, do we believe that, in fact, what we're doing, and I thank Les for bringing forward cases in which actually a sort of strategy has been working effectively in order to strengthen supply chain, and it's very good, for theory. But the point is, do we think we have learned enough in order to face other forms of pandemic? That's the point. The point is this: so there was an obsession in Europe during the first year of the pandemic about the fact that we should stockpile things in order to get ready. The healthcare system should stockpile kind of personal protective equipment. And then all of a sudden we woke up in the moment and said, but maybe those PPEs won't be useful for another pandemic. What we're going to do? We're going to stock 35 billion masks, underground for what? For 6 months, and then we have to throw them away because they will not be effective anymore. So there is, the point that I think it's happening, we're kind of started to get out of the, I would say, very emotional part, reaction towards pandemic, try to think more coldly about this. But when you get more rational, I agree with you, Ram, things become very difficult because you don't know where to look for and what to look for. So, and go back to my point. The point is some form of coordination is needed, and one of the lessons is that the global trade broke down because of COVID. So we want to go back to that starting point. We have to make sure that barriers are not erected the day after a pandemic is declared. Otherwise, you can have any sort of extremely resilient global supply chain, and nothing's gonna function properly.
That's an interesting point, Gian, because
one more comment on this is just, I think, another outcome of COVID. I think what companies are doing now, in the post-COVID era, is that I think while these questions of forecasting accuracy, these are all fundamental questions that are going to remain. But what companies are doing is they're trying to make their supply chains a lot more agile, a lot more, adaptable, and a lot more responsive to external disruptions. I think that's what's the other thing what companies are doing in order to, like Gian said, will another pandemic happen? When will it happen? You can't really predicate based on that. Instead you focus on process, you make your supply chain more responsive in the hope that will make your response to another disruption better. You can't really predict another pandemic or another disruption like this. So if you make your supply chain responsible and agile, it might be a better solution than trying to focus on.
So let me just take both your comments and combine them and have a snowball effect for Les now. So let us look at it.
Poor Les, the victim of the snowball.
So
the slopes of the Swiss mountains.
What new practices have you seen when it comes to risk profiling in supply chains? Pre-COVID, post-COVID, and how have these affected the service levels? You said that some of the companies did leverage, but how did it in general affect the service levels from a risk perspective? So we're not talking about generally, stocking up inventory, but even assessing risk and looking at risks. And how have they affected the costs? Because more different kind of risk assessment will have different cost implications. And what specific challenges do you see in the current approach to risk profiling in various organizations?
Okay. Well, I'm an old guy, okay, and I therefore don't have a great memory. So I would like to make one point before I start with that question. We often, when we talk about this really, really mission critical topic, we often just get down to processes and strategy and the big picture. But we very rarely talk about employee capability, organizational capability in terms of human resources. And one of the things that I have seen, probably going back to the financial crisis in 2008, because this isn't just about COVID, it's financial instability, it's tsunamis, it's geopolitics. It's, as you said, Gian, it's a different flavor of the same stuff. Never a boring day in procurement and supply chain, we know that. And I think it's how organizations, and I'll talk about the agility that Ram talked about in terms of internally, but it's the agility of the organization's human resources and human capital that I think is distinguishing the successful companies going forward. And in each of the companies that I've worked for in the last 20 years, they've all heavily invested in not just upskilling their resources, not just in procurement and supply chain, but in adjacent parts of the organization, so that people understand if you build complexity into engineering, into your products, you're going to pay for it in terms of supply chain complexity. And if you don't invest in resilience, Mr. Finance or Mrs. Finance, it's going to cost you somewhere different outside of the piece price, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a huge investment, not just in terms of helping people technically with the skill set to use new technology, but also building the culture of one where people want to stay, they want to be retained, they want to be attracted to that organization, because it's being invested in terms of giving people the skills to get things done. And I think resilience and sustainability is a big one. So I've probably used up all my time, but
sorry, so this particular point, are you talking about internal to the organization or looking at the suppliers, or both?
Both. I mean, I think collaboration with suppliers. I hosted a supplier day back in my ABB days, and some of the suppliers at lunchtime said they thought they were in the wrong event because there hadn't been discussion about collaboration for a long time. It had been, like all industrial companies, talking about, piece price reduction and costs, and I think there was a kind of recognition that in many organizations in the industrial and energy and electrical sectors that says we need to work more collaboratively with our suppliers. We'll talk about vendor managed inventory maybe if we have time, but there was a time for that. But if you just push your inventory out to the suppliers and you don't do any work on risk profiling and understanding your end customers, you're just pushing the problem onto somebody else's books. So
exactly.
Yeah. But going back to the question, in terms of new practices, I think there's been much more partnering with senior leadership and finance than I've ever seen in the last 40 years of my career. Probably in the last 10 years, 15 years, I've seen that. So there's much more sponsorship at a senior level around risk, sustainability, and resilience. Procurement, I think, has got a bigger seat at the table now than ever before in supply chain. That's one of the very few positive things that came out of COVID, for sure. In terms of risk profiling, there's been a huge amount of work on digitizing internal operation activities and capabilities, and probably a more profound use of big data. But I still think many organizations are still trying to get their arms around, how to use that big data the most efficiently and to have the most impact. The trends and behavior of suppliers, beyond financial stability is certainly a key area that's been looked at.
So the way you're describing, Les, the way you're putting it across, it looks like finding a supplier is more difficult than finding a partner.
I don't think so. I think if everything you see is a nail, you're going to hit it with a hammer. And I think there are many suppliers out there that would be very good partners. But if you hit them with a hammer because they look like a nail, then you're never going to get your screwdriver out. Yeah. So I've got an engineering background.
It's
me too.
Les, if I may, it's really amazing that for someone like me, who's sort of a weird animal, a little bit of academic, a little bit of a civil servant, the 20 years ago, I remember vividly a lady who's now professor at University of Pennsylvania was presenting a couple of papers actually published in the American Economic Review about how to build an ecosystem, so collaboration in the supply chain. So she used a kind of a misnomer, a little bit, network. So a network is something different, but she meant really this idea of not squeezing your suppliers because you want to convince them, you're giving them extra profit margin so that they can invest in an insurance policy that will work in your favor, when an adverse event will strike. And we economists were talking about it 20 years ago, but actually it was just a paper. So it was completely lack of communication between which something that I thought at that time was extremely relevant to the profession, management profession. But for us, it was just a model, but a model which made a lot of sense because it said cooperation is something, or competition, it's not something that you can detach from the temporal dimension. So risk assessment and time horizon are really two important factors. When you take this into account, all of a sudden the way you define or design competitive processes to get inputs will be completely different. You will tend to kind of soften price competition to sort of allow your suppliers to get extra profits. Why? Because you want to convince them to invest in solution that might be beneficial at a later stage. And that's exactly what you say. Call it cooperation. This is nothing more than an insurance strategy for which you have to pay something up front. And this is nothing. It's inevitable. You have to put money on that in order to get something else in return at a later stage.
And I think this particular point is quite interesting because we would actually try to look at the aspect of resilience through through vendor managed inventories, which we were talking about, which Les had just mentioned. And it is one of the time tested methods to reduce your working costs because you're shifting your cost to your supplier. But so what are the good examples of collaboration now, looking at the new enthusiasm in resilience and the new models that are evolving?
Can I take that, Ram?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and I would have used exactly the same terminology. It's a time-tested method to get working capital off the books. But I think one of the big things that's changed is that organizations are looking at the total cost of ownership and the total cost of working capital, and including the working capital in the first and second tier suppliers. And I think only when you look at it as a complete ecosystem are you really going to get the full picture from a cost and from a risk point of view. I think one of the secret sources of moving from something like vendor managed inventory to maybe more collaborative approach with suppliers. One of the secrets maybe that we did, we brought together our most strategic suppliers in a very small group with the leader of engineering, the business leader, the product management leader, and the procurement guy and HR. And we said to them, okay, each one of you, tell us, what do we need to do differently for you to put your best people on our products, your best engineers, your best logisticians? And we kept quiet for a whole morning and we listened to a dozen suppliers telling the organization what they liked about us, but what we could do differently. And it was an aha moment for the organization. Mm-hmm. And it immediately started to build, were you there on that day? Because that was the day when there was partnership and collaboration. So that was a small thing. But going back to VMI, it can help resilience. But I've seen too many instances where organizations have just shifted the inventory and haven't done anything with the strategy or the risk profiling. They don't really understand the behavior of the end customers. They haven't done that evaluation, Dr. Gurjar, that I know that you're greatly skilled at in terms of understanding the unpredictability of your customers. And of course, it just leads to chaos in the supply chain. So it's there are additional, maybe more robust ways. I've seen this increased collaboration, which has led to massive design changes in products to reduce the complexity. Late point definition of products going way back in Ford in the 90s, but even more recently in companies like Eaton, ABB, and Otis. Coming up with designs that are designed to purchase, not designed to value and designed to cost, but really designed for total cost.
For total cost.
Yeah. So Ram, I think one important thing which he was talking about was looking at the end customer behavior. So if we talk about digitalization of operations versus digitalization of end customer behavior, so there are a lot of initiatives which go in digitalizing the operations rather than looking at the customer interface. How do you look at the relative trade-offs, of the former versus the latter? And the question is, are we spending the money on digitalization on the right thing today, or you think there has to be a change?
I think Well, the short answer is yes. We are spending money and lots of it on digitalization, right? Companies realize the importance of digitalization. But the 2 points that you mentioned, the two aspects, they typically constitute the, I would say, the digitalization strategy per se. One is investing in operations, which is more inward looking. The other one is investing in customer behavior. I think both these have, I would say, I wouldn't view it as one versus other, but it's just a matter of striking the balance between investing in both, because for an organization to be successful, it has to invest in both. And depending on, I would say, the maturity, the type of industry is, it's how you make that, is it a 50-50, is it a 70-30, is it a 20-80? All this depends on I would say the nature of the organization. But first, I think, let me just explain, I think, what you refer to as digitalization of operations, right? It's, if for the benefit of our audience, it's I would say, you're
Also,
optimizing your internal process, you're enhancing efficiency, you're automating processes. These are all what constitute, investment in digitalizing your operation, and these tend to
also,
have
if
an
you
impact
Ram,
on your
Ram,
bottom
if
line.
you Ram, if you have a framework which will help to decide, how this trade-off has to be arrived at, that would be useful.
I think, see, as a consultant, the easiest answer is it depends. That's the answer that we usually always use. um, I will say that the trade-offs typically, right, is in terms of, I would say, see, look at it from a if you are in a manufacturing, I think you will see that ultimately you will have to get the return on investment in your into how much you spend. So depending on how much understanding consumer behavior is going to give you, it depends on the competitive landscape. So if you were to compare, say, manufacturing versus retail, it's a completely different, it's an apples to orange comparison, right? Because in retail, there is a high degree of emphasis placed on understanding consumer behavior, because the
Yeah.
cost of acquiring a customer and customer loyalty is that much harder. In terms of manufacturing, you invest in a customer to buy once. That's probably sometimes good enough, because the returns on selling one piece is much better. So I would say, manufacturing, and again, the other point that I mentioned is depending on how digitally mature your company is. If you're already have a high degree of, I would say, digitalization in your operations, maybe then you tweak. But I would say there's no particular framework. I say it's understanding the organizational goals, understanding where you are with regard to your competitors, um, and what your priorities are. Whether is it yes, less.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I think you're
Uh,
absolutely right, Ram. But I think what I've seen in my most recent experience is, if you tried to justify and get a cost return on digitization just for resilience, you would never make it. But the benefits of digitization go far and wide, top to bottom in an organization, whether it's in terms of customer acquisition, retention, or operational effectiveness, or you name it, you can throw a metric at it. And I think these days this is an entry ticket. It's almost like training and development, for the new future, the new norm. How do we equip the organization? Well, it's digitization. And how do we equip the people? Well, it's training and development. And without it, you're not going to be competing in 5 to 10 years time. And
so
so
let's
the return
let's
is, yeah.
there is an interesting point to what you're saying. Maybe one of the questions which the audience has put forward is that how could you look at something which you cannot control in any case? So in the digitalization context, this also is important. Like, would you like to add to that, to what you were saying with this?
Well, I think as Jan said, the next issue is going to be probably the least predicted one, and
Yep.
so in the if you go back to Dr. Deming and lean principles, you can do your failure mode analysis, but you might miss some. So it's all around being agile, and you may not be able to predict what the issue is going to be, but what you can do is you can predict what your action is going to be. And it might be basic activities, it might be basic processes, but it will all be about protecting the end customer, protecting the supply chain, whilst meeting the values and the rules of the road in the organization and doing business. But yeah, you're not going to be able to predict everything, but the digitization will give you a lot of data that will probably help you predict a lot. But then
And it helps in posturing. It helps in posturing.
Yeah.
So even if I cannot control that, I can definitely posture to that. That is something which which probably is the bottom line of what you are trying to say.
Yeah, posturing. I've lived outside of the UK for too long. My vocabulary is not as good as yours. Posturing is exactly the right word.
It's richer. It's richer. Nikhil, do you mind if I take advantage of one particular question? There are so many questions. I'm not sure we're gonna be able to answer them all.
Let us complete our discussion, and then we'll go to the questions. I took this question because this was linked to what we were discussing, so that's why I just talked about it.
I think one I think the simplest way, and most of the audience in India might like this. I'm not sure about you, Les, but India's former cricket captain, right, MS Dhoni, always used to say, focus on the process, not the outcome. So that's what I think procurement leaders have to do, is focus on the process of becoming more agile, responsive. You're not going to predict, what the outcome is going to be, but focus on the process, the results will be better.
Yeah, but if you want to use a cricket analogy, and I didn't want to get sucked into it,
but if you're very sensitive to that.
If you take the way the England team are currently playing, they've got that camaraderie and one team spirit, and all for one and one for all, and so creating the culture in the organization around resilience,
right?
It is really very powerful, and it can make up for an awful lot of deficits in skill. If we talk about the England team,
yeah. One particular aspect which I have seen, the past few years, we've been talking a lot about procurement changes and supply chain changes, but sometimes you feel whether one has to really change, or doing good by doing nothing is also a strategy which is possible. So is this a good paradigm in today's scenario? Because we talk about the microeconomic perspective again, and then we say, okay, are we overreacting or overdriving the concept of supply chain continuity and resilience? It's not that a pandemic is going to happen every year, and of course the thing that might happen we cannot even predict, and we cannot even fathom what is going to happen. So are we overdoing it, and is doing good by doing nothing a good strategy in this case? I think Gian, probably you could touch upon that.
Well, I'm gonna sort of steer towards a little bit my sort of natural environment, which is public procurement, and because that definition would apply almost completely to what's happening. I mean, my impression, we've learned a lot. I mean, there is a my impression is that one of the lessons that we have overemphasized is that during the pandemic there were different kind of abuses here and there, and it always boils down, when you talk about public procurement, it all boils down to what are the rules. Maybe the rules were not the right rules. There was an abuse because we didn't have our procurement vehicles for emergency contracting and so on and so forth. And it is as if by fixing the rules, I mean, a lot of countries are fixing the rules right now, we're going to go back to business as if the pandemic never
Never
existed.
took place here.
Never took place. So there was a point that we had a very long discussion with people, especially in the UK, and a couple of very good academics saying now that, we should have, framework agreements for emergency circumstances always in place so that we do not use direct contracting that would leave, open the door to abuses of any sort. Actually, the National Audit Office completing an enormous work, a gigantic work, retrospective work in what happened during the pandemic. We're going to learn a lot about that. But again, this is misguided approach. The procurement vehicle, framework agreements. Let me take it. This is my natural ocean in which I, swim every day. Framework agreements are exactly the tools, coming from an agile approach to procurement. So it's a vehicle in which you tend to shift risk towards your suppliers. But if the risk is there and you don't take any stake in that risk, and you live under the illusion that you have a framework agreement in place, and though someone else is going to take care of the disruption when the COVID-21 strikes, this is again another fantasy. We're going to live again, we experience exactly the same problem. So what we're doing right now, we're living under this umbrella, in this fake umbrella of protection, saying, oh, we have a framework agreement, we're fine. Okay. Yeah. Secondly, let me mention that, and I want to, I want to take advantage of this conversation to say the World Bank has published a very insightful set of guidelines about risk management in public procurement. This is one of the key dimensions is completely overlooked in public procurement. Okay, when you evaluate your suppliers, almost no one in Europe takes into account what happens if something, adverse takes place at a later stage, and what are the kind of strategies that your suppliers are planning to take in place in order to protect you as a final customer. Right? This is something striking because we should spend most of our time doing that right now, rather than going back to business and say, oh, we have another framework agreement in place and we're fine. We're not fine. We're back to business. We're back to position zero again. So, and this is dramatic. Let me conclude this by, again, borrowing from one question. The main difference between the meaning of cooperation in the private sector and in the private sector is dramatic. There is a gulf, an ocean between. Why? Because in the private sector, there is still the possibility of setting an unwritten set of code of conduct, which based on actions. If I leave in your pockets an extra margin of profits, I will at some point look at what you do under abnormal circumstances, whether you reciprocate. And this is much easier because we have, long-term relationship, we can observe action. But in a public procurement world, which is mainly driven by written rules, these observing, punishing, reacting is much more difficult because it's all driven by contracts, written contracts. I know less. In the UK, things are fairly different, but not that different, and this is why we are sort of more fragile, the public sector, because sometimes we do not want to use rules of the game, which are a little bit more flexible, sure, which would lend them to potential manipulation, but still more agile and more, I would say, appropriate to react in case of adverse circumstances. This is the heart. Yeah. This is the heart of the problem.
I'm absolutely with you, Gian. I actually haven't lived in the UK for 30 years, but I know exactly what you mean. And some discussions with UK government commercial section, they have the same challenges. But I'm absolutely with you. The agility is absolutely necessary. But you also talked about this law of unintended consequences as well, and not just thinking about does this fix the risk, but what happens 6 months, 60 months down the line, and there's not enough investment of thought around that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
The one comment that I'd like to make also is that in terms of talking about doing nothing, doing all these things, I would say in terms of principles per se, pre-COVID, post-COVID, nothing much has changed in terms of the way we look at supply chains, we look at setting up supply chains in terms of principle. Some of these are stuff that we've known all along, but just that we've not, focused on compliance. I mean, we have really good contracts with most suppliers, but again, unlike the public sector, I'm speaking predominantly from a private sector standpoint, is most of the it's the focus on compliance has become a lot more. The spotlight now is on having these principles and adhering to them. Earlier you could get away with certain tweaks. I think it's something that I guess the private sector is learning from the public sector, where it's almost a straight jacket. I understand, Gian, where there are focus was only on compliance, and you could left very little room for maneuvering. But again, this is something maybe one of the very few I would say scenarios where.
Incidentally, Ram, I had worked in the public procurement space as well, and I had looked at how we could incentivize PPP agreements. Unfortunately, today PPP agreements are not incentivized for the efficiency or the efficacy. They are more, looking at the financing costs and the
Financing
operating
costs.
costs, but they are not
Yeah.
looking at the efficiency for the customer. So when we introduced that in certain tenders, it was a welcome change. I mean, people really took to it. So, okay, there are rules. I agree that there are rules. As long as the rules are applied to everyone, a public
And
procurement
uniformly
is safe.
enforced.
Yeah, a
But I
public
think,
procurement is safe.
but I think with public procurement, also the introduction, and we see it in many countries of competition, then there starts to become more focus on customer satisfaction, and you can see that in the post office, the health service, and in different countries, and so.
So let's take one last question which has come from the audience. How can you develop a strategic procurement resilience framework or in a private sector? Yeah. So how do you develop that? So I think Les and Ram,
Les
you
would
could
be,
probably touch on that. Yeah.
I don't. I think to have a big picture target. So really, I think it's capturing the imagination of the organization, and resilience and risk. They're just other nodes that are going to come along and affect the supply chain. They're just further inputs, and so to treat them as completely alien and different is probably not the right thing to do. You need to have a comprehensive strategy, procurement, operations, supply chain strategy that really embraces all areas of risk, all inputs, whether it's regulations, doing business right, whatever. And
anything specific to the leadership? I mean, if you can touch upon that.
I think it's around. I'm a big believer in ADKAR, which is a PROC change management approach, and ADKAR, starts with A for awareness, D for desire. And with the awareness, you need to get with the executives and actually mentor and even coach them into sponsoring what you want to do, and to sell to them in terms of the desire, what is the output for them. And it may not be short-term savings, but it will be long-term, earnings before interest and tax that will magnify as you start to get a more robust strategy in place. And part of the ADKAR change management is also having the ability of the organization in place. So it's a very holistic approach. It's a multi-year approach. And risk is one big element, but it's how do you make your operations more serving the customer and bringing the customer and the suppliers closer to yourself as part of the value chain.
And definitely, I think the other, investing in technology and digital is going to be a big part of developing procurement resilience, because now you need greater visibility, not just into your suppliers, but their suppliers and so on. So you need real-time data on where your freight is, so you can make decisions or adapt. So I would say, in order to enable all the stuff that we've spoken about in terms of developing procurement resilience, I think having investing in technology, investing in building a responsive supply chain, investing in being agile and being able to adapt to an ever-changing scenario. These are all various aspects that organizations should consider in terms of as they look to build procurement resilience, I think, and collaboration. I think the one thing that we didn't emphasize enough, if we haven't already, is I think post-COVID, there's been, well, procurement has always known collaboration is the cornerstone of a supply chain. I think the other parts of the organizations have now woken up to the reality that, the more you collaborate with all your stakeholders along the value chain, the better you are going to be in terms of
exactly.
And Ram, you talk about the process investment, but I think it's also the investment in the people and the organization. So making sure you've got the capability and the capacity. And for years, the organizations have been squeezed. I know there's a section later, another panel on procurement as a career. I mean, I think the last few years and the next few years, procurement is at the epicenter of organizations now. I mean, never before has the net value of a procurement person been so high, and I think it's a great place to be. But if you don't invest in the people, they'll go and disappoint companies that will invest in them. Yeah.
I hope the person who had put the question got the answer. We would now wind up with a few closing remarks on this. So I would invite each of you to summarize in just about 30 to 45 seconds. Yeah, we'll start with Gian.
Thank you, Nikhil. I guess if I were to list the word that we've mentioned more frequently during the last 60 minutes is people and collaboration. Now, from a microeconomist perspective, collaboration is about time horizon, so cannot be built in 2 days. So it's a time frame question, and secondly, it's about incentives. And it's about having an array of actions which is rich enough in order to observe the way different partners react to changing environment. So let me say that the private sector is in the best possible to experiment new forms of collaborations, and hopefully the public one will look at it and try to cherry pick at least seeds of wisdom at a later stage.
To put it in economic terms, probably looking at an indifference curve where you can do it in-house or you can do it through someone else. That would be the ideal kind of collaboration.
Also. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah. Les, you would like to?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dr. Gurjar. It's been a pleasure. I mean, yes, we talk about process and strategy, but I think it's equally about people and organization. In terms of people and organization, it's about the culture, creating that winning culture, the mindset. Risk isn't going to go away. It's been with us for the last 100 years. It will be with us for the next 100 years. It's just a different flavor. It could be dark chocolate, milk chocolate, or it could be flavored chocolate, but chocolate is here to stay. Okay, we know that in Switzerland. It is about collaboration. It's about building that partnership across the whole value chain, starting from even the third-tier suppliers through to your customers, and looking at it from a total cost management perspective. So don't just look at your own bailiwick, look beyond, because the total cost is what's going to impact the organization. Thank you.
Yeah. Ram, would you like to?
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I just want to summarize by saying I think the focus would be on, in an ever-changing scenario, as there's a lot of globalization in the supply chain, the focus still would be on developing lean supply chains that are responsive, that are able to respond to challenges and disruptions as quickly as humanly possible. And I think using technology, using collaboration, using I think a better upskilling of individuals to be able to provide that change or drive that change across the procurement function is what we're going to see. So happy to be in part, and I gained a lot of insight from Les and Dr. Gian as well. And Thanks again, Nikhil,
Thank you.
for
Thank you.
Yep.
moderating this panel
Thanks a
really
lot.
well.
Yeah. So
Thank
one
you.
of the important things that we've seen in this particular panel is the importance of looking at pandemics, which is not just a supply chain disruption, but it's also going to pan out as a geopolitical event. And a
It is.
geopolitical influence on supply chain is becoming more and more predominant now. And in future, we are going to see more of these. So what we had as a discussion today was just looking at certain aspects of that. But I think as time would progress, we are going to see a lot more on this particular front. And I think it was really an interesting discussion. Yeah, thank you, Ram. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gian. And thanks, Pamela, for inviting us and for ensuring that everything runs smooth. Thanks again. Over to you, Pamela.
And
Thank you, Dr. Gurjar. Thank you for this rich discussion. To all the esteemed members of the panel, thanks for this. So now we'll be moving on to our next session.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.